Good morning or afternoon, everyone. So try this out. I'm still sort of waiting to hear some things from the university. The Norton has sent me information regarding the textbook, so I'll send that out shortly. Still waiting on ebook access for Connected. If we can't get that, then we'll figure something else out. University is trying to decide about grading this semester, so a lot of stuff is in the air right now. So once I know more there, I'll update the class accordingly. But as of right now, I'm just going to get back into the material, kind of where we left off, looking at gender and inequalities. Today's lecture is going to be, a little bit short. I'm not going to go the whole sort of class period. I don't think that's necessary. And I will be available on Canvas chat during the normal class period. Okay, so one of the things that we've seen where we've seen some major changes in terms of the world of work is that we're seeing that women's labor force participation has been going steadily up since the 1950s. I think it's important to understand. Let me go back here. I think it's important to understand that. Back in the 100 years ago or so, a lot of women were actually working, and this idea of the modern housewife is something that really comes about in the 1950s. You didn't really have the sort of housewife as we think of it today before then, where there's a lot of appliances in the kitchen and things like that. So it was a sort of a different situation. In the last recession that we had, it was kind of interesting because it hit the housing market and it hit the financial sector and construction and so on. So it hit sectors that are generally comprised of male workers. So for a little while during the last recession, actually women briefly outnumbered men in the labor force, which was really kind of striking sociologically. So that's pretty fascinating. Then as the economy recovered, men, I think there's still more men now in the workforce, and for reasons which we'll talk about. As I said, but women's participation has been rising over the last half century or so. Again, one of the things, I think we got into this last time, but I'll just go over it again, something we call gender typing, where we see that, certain jobs are more likely to be held by one gender or the other rather than the other. So as an example, as you can see, a lot of healthcare professions. We see a lot of the workers now that are on the front lines, trying to save our society from COVID-19. A lot of these are going to be women. We see that women are the majority of pharmacists now. A little over a third of lecturers, and less in other positions such as civil engineers and HVAC and installers and so on. When we look at women managers, that we see more women in management than in the past. I think the difference is that we see. Put myself somewhere over here. Maybe I'll just go back over here. Okay, so we see more women. Women are in management more, and they're managing organizations that tend to work on and employ more women. I shouldn't say work on women's issues, but tend to be social service agencies and things like that. Things that, again, we associate more, they're more gender typed towards women. I think this is a pretty fascinating chart. Let's go up here now. This looks at how male and female economists feel about different things. I may have gone over this, but I'll go over it again. So you see here, I think one of the big differences oranges females, that you see that there's a huge disagreement between male and female economists in terms of market solutions are superior to government intervention. This is something that male economists tend to strongly agree with. Female economists are more likely to strongly disagree with it. And right now, everybody is more or less agreeing with female economists as the government gets very involved in the economy. In favor of limited austerity. What is austerity? Austerity means like the cutting of social service programs. So if you were to cut food stamps right now, or cut welfare and so on and so forth, that would be pretty disastrous. You'd see there's pretty much close agreement between the sexes on that in terms of the economists. And big difference between on environmental protection. So you see that women economists are more likely to take environmental protection seriously than men. And labor market opportunities being unequal, perhaps no surprise that women who are subjected to these inequalities are more likely to see this. So anyway, I think it's pretty fascinating, just in terms of how we think about economics and stuff like that. Even economists think about it differently based upon gender. Okay, again, looking at some of these the occupations, comparing the jobs in 1970 to 2010. If you went into a bar in 1970, you'd probably be served by a male bartender. Today, there's, more than, a 50-50 chance that, it'll be a woman serving you a drink. A third of doctors are now women, roughly a third of lawyers, and so on and so forth. But again, you see these positions, registered nurses, secretaries, elementary, middle school teachers, where the percentage has really not changed at all since the 1970s. So that's pretty interesting. Those jobs are fairly well gender typed. And, that's something that maybe, in a class on gender, you could dive into in more detail to try and figure out, why that is, what's going on there. Right now, we know, as many of you probably know, that women are more likely to have earned a bachelor's degree. We have more women in college right now than men. And this is going to be, this is going to kind of shake things up a bit, as, women in many relationships are the primary earner. And this is a big change because, in our society, our pop culture and so on, it's still in many ways it's shown that, the male is the bread earner in heterosexual relationships. Increasingly, that's changing, and we'll just have to see how society adjusts and adapts to these changes. Okay, as I said, there's these inequalities in the workplace. We call this the glass ceiling, that women may be rising, rising in their organization, but they hit this ceiling where there's a certain point at which they can't really rise anymore, where they can't, go up into the upper levels of management. So what's going on here? A few things. For most of the last few decades, it's been sexism that has kept people down, and you still have that going on at upper management in a lot of organizations. Other things that are also related, some changes here. So one of the big changes that we're seeing is the difference, I should be scratching my face, right? The difference that we're seeing between women who are salaried, professional, versus women who don't have a college degree. So I had a friend who did a study comparing how women who had professional degrees like law, medicine, and so on, handled pregnancy versus women who were low-wage workers, oftentimes didn't have a college degree, and so on, how they handled pregnancy. And what was really fascinating was that, first of all, the women without college degrees tended to have children earlier. just out after high school, that sort of thing, in their early 20s. The women who went on to get professional degrees, they had children later, usually in their late 20s or early 30s. They reported feeling much more stress, and the experience of pregnancy was much more stressful for them than for the women who were not in professional positions. Why is that? If you're working towards a law degree or a graduate degree, you've got a lot of plans. You're a few years of college, maybe take a gap year or something, then you go on to graduate school or law school, and then, you got to join a firm and so on. And then by the time you're, just entering the organization, just the biological clock is ticking, and you see that women at this time want to start their families. Except, the pregnancy and children are they're not like, working towards a degree where you sort of plan everything out. There's a lot of unpredictability and uncertainty and so on. And so that's one reason that she found that a lot of these women had a lot of stress with their experience of pregnancy. In terms of where the best place to work for women are, as you can see on this chart, the Scandinavian countries really tend to be well represented in the top 7, top 8 or so, and a number of other predominantly Western European countries. The United States is the 20th. Ranked number 20, the OECD average. OECD are basically all these rich countries. Okay, so again, as I was saying, we see a big change in terms of in terms of earnings, the change in earnings. So if you look what happens to women and men's earnings after pregnancy. So this chart over here, this first one. Based on a study in Denmark, but the data looks pretty similar for the United States. If you see this chart here, this is years before and after the birth of the first child. So here you've got years before. Here you've got going to the right, you've got years afterward. So you can see basically after the birth of the first child, the earnings go down for women quite substantially, and they never quite recover. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. For men, they go down slightly, but really don't make much of a change at all. When you look at fallen mothers' long-term earnings due to children in terms of the percentage, again, and this is down here, you got hours worked by a woman's mother relative to her father. You got a huge decline in their long-term earnings. This is a problem. Our system has been kind of developed, our employment system, how we give leave for parents and so on has been, more or less set up for men and has not really been designed or, sort of adapted for the experience that a lot of women may have. So what we also see is that while women are working more, women are going into the workforce in large numbers, and that means that men have been picking up some of the slack in terms of the, household chores, and men are doing more household chores in heterosexual relationships. Nonetheless, we still see that women tend to come home from their full-time jobs and start what the sociologist Arlie Hochschild called the second shift, where they start working on chores and things like that around the home, childcare and so on. What's kind of interesting is we find that men who are employed with a 40-hour job, a full-time job, are more likely to do housework than men who are unemployed. And you may think, well, how's that? These unemployed men have all this time on their hands. Shouldn't they be doing some dishes and, so on? Well, I think there's a stigma that comes with unemployment, and it, leads to a lot of depression and anxiety and things like that. All of which tends to dampen, productivity, and makes people not want to do things like chores. But so anyway, as we're heading into a definite recession, that's something to keep in mind. Some of these gender aspects. Okay, so as I was saying earlier, we find that let me explain this chart. So this is looking at the fact that we see that a lot of women are delaying motherhood through their 20s. So this is, again, a huge change. So the orange line, or that yellow line here, represents data from 2014, and the green line is from 1994. And so you've got the ages here on the bottom, going from age 12 all the way to age 44. The percentage of women of ages 40 to 44 who had given birth by that age. So people who are 44 in 2014 and 1994 is basically what they're looking at, and when they had their first children. So you see some big differences. Basically, the big differences are that back in the 1990s, 20 years ago, women were having children at a much earlier age than today. What's also interesting, though, is that we see that, and what this chart shows is that actually motherhood has not gone down, though, in total numbers. What's just happening is that by the time you're in the 30s, you start to see the numbers catch up. In fact, you start to see it go over a little bit. So that just basically means that it's not that there's less children being born and less motherhood going on. It's just that it's happening at a later time. This is looking at all women. Again, you can look at this by different ethnic groups, and you still see this relationship. You see some big changes by ethnic groups as well, but again, you see the same basic trend across all ethnic groups in the United States. Okay. Okay, so sexual harassment in the workplace. So this is something that has come to the forefront with the Me Too movement and so on. So you're probably familiar with sexual harassment, making unwanted sexual advances on someone in the workplace. So here you've got a chart of sexual harassment complaints that were reported to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Now, pay attention to this chart. You see there's a big jump in terms of the early 1990s, and you may wonder what happened there. Is there a big increase in terms of sexual harassment? No, that's not what's going on here. You have a big increase in the reporting of sexual harassment in the 1990s. And what happens in this time period that leads to this? Well, if you remember a couple of years ago now, the Christine Blasey Ford made the allegations against the nominee and now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh that he had sexually abused her. And people, this brought up memories of when Anita Hill accused Judge Clarence Thomas of sexually harassing her when she was his employee. And that was roughly around 91, 92. And what one of those things that did was that led to this increase in terms of awareness of sexual harassment. And you see that this big increase that happens in the 1990s isn't showing that sexual harassment starts increasing in the 90s, just that complaints start being made during the 1990s. Okay, looking at women in government, and let's see, I think I'll probably just kind of go through these rather quickly then. Okay, so anyway, we know that women are underrepresented in all levels of government. In the United States, you're more likely to see women in local rather than national politics. If you go to a city council meeting, you're more likely to see more women proportionally there than probably if you go to a state legislature or Congress or something like this. Currently, the Democratic Party has the highest number of women politicians. Now, I think in the United States, we often think that we're sort of leading the way in terms of gender equality and, women's political representation. That's not really the case. We rank 70th out of 187 countries when it comes to women's political representation. Now, this chart is from 2012, so it's not completely accurate, but it's still pretty close, and it's nonetheless worth thinking about. There's a lot of this that hasn't changed. So this is looking at the seats that are held as a percent of the total of women in legislature, so in Congress or in Parliament and things like that. Looking at all these different countries. I believe Rwanda still has the highest percentage of women in their parliament. Then you've got Sweden, a number of other countries. This red dotted line is the world average, and look where the United States is, or where we were in 2012. I don't know where we stand if you were to update this chart to, say, 2020 after the 2018 midterms when we had a historic number of women elected. I don't know if that puts us above the world average yet or not. But nonetheless, if we're not, I think we still may be behind the world average, or maybe we just came in front of it. But nonetheless, we've been behind the world average for a long time. Behind countries, the United States might be surprised about, such as Britain or Mexico, Italy, Israel, United Arab Emirates, France, etc. As you know, the United States has not had a female president, a chief executive. We've seen that happen in many countries around the world. And this is the bars there looking at the total number of years that a woman has essentially run the country as president or as prime minister. So you can take a look at that, and there's quite a bit of women have been running, countries for many years in many places. We saw some big differences in terms of the 2016 election. More women voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. When you break that down by ethnicity, it's kind of interesting. Slightly more women voted for white women voted for Trump than Hillary, but just by about a percentage or something. We'll probably see some changes in this next election. And as I said, the Me Too movement came about to address issues of harassment and beyond just the harassment that you see at work, but actual threats of physical violence and acts of physical and sexual abuse. And so a few things here. One is that we know that most rapes are not reported. So, and we know why this is. It becomes a very complex situation because oftentimes there's not physical evidence. And so usually a woman, it's not only women who get raped, but the majority of sexual assault victims are women. So oftentimes there's a huge burden that's placed on women to be able to prove it. And, a lot of women don't want to be put under the spotlight like that. The defense attorney will examine their sexual life, their sexual behavior, and a lot of women don't know if they want to go through all that to have to not be able to prove that they were raped. So I think for those of you who are in criminology and going into law, this is one area that's that law really needs to work on. How do we really address this problem? Again, without immediate physical evidence usually being available. So this is a big challenge for, I think, legal thinkers. So it's kind of one thing we often hear, I think, is this statistic that roughly, a fifth of women in college will be victims of sexual assault. What we don't hear is what percentage of men commit these sexual assaults. That's a much harder number to figure out. One scary study that's been, I don't know if it's actually been scientifically replicated, but I know anecdotally some people have done surveys and classes and found similar results. Found that a third of college men would commit rape if they could get away with it. So that's alarming. As I said, that's kind of varies by place, and more studies need to be done to replicate to see if that number is actually real, because that's, as I said, that's fairly alarming. Okay, is there any good news that we can point to? Well, kind of like crime rates in general. Kind of like crime rates in general, we've seen that since the 1990s, violent crime has plummeted quite dramatically in the United States and in most places in the world. And we see the same thing for sexual assaults. We see that sexual assaults have plummeted too. Now, if you look at this chart, though, it's kind of interesting. You see that total rapes and sexual assaults have fallen, completed sexual assaults have fallen, but threatened and attempted sexual assaults have not really changed a whole lot. I mean, they've kind of gone up and down. Now, this is data coming from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, from the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey. So here's what's important to understand, is that these rape threats don't include online harassment. So these are just threats that have been reported to the police. Now, so if you were to include, say, online harassment, online rape threats, I would say that actually we've seen those numbers probably skyrocket since 2010. Attempted rape, as I said, hasn't changed too much. So what's going on here? Well, it's hard to say. I can only speculate on what's going on here. That, more women have taken self-defense classes. Maybe more men are, maybe, I don't know. I think more of it has to do with women saying no. But again, that's just speculation, so you can't take me too seriously on that. So I started my academic career by looking at sexual violence during warfare. And we see that rape is often used as a tool of conflict. And as you can see in these charts here, it's used by insurgent forces, it's used by government forces. Sexual assault really accompanies most warfare. Something a lot of people don't know is that when the Soviet Union invaded Germany during the Second World War, they wanted revenge after, the Nazis had, destroyed a lot of Eastern Russia. Yes, Western Russia, sorry. And they wanted revenge, and how they did that was by trying to humiliate the Germans by committing mass rape of German women. So there are estimates of roughly 150 to 200,000 East German women being raped by Soviet soldiers. Huge aspect of history that often, I should say, almost always is neglected, but is a huge, almost, this comes along with a lot of wars that we see. I saw a presentation one time of a guy talking about cybernetics and robot soldiers and stuff like that. And one of the things about having robot soldiers is that you could program them not to commit sexual violence, and that's one way to think about it, I guess. But that's sort of a different issue. Now, let's see where we are. Yeah, I'll be going to men. I'll just end on this slide for today, and then talk about men on Friday. So again, the other thing we need to understand is that, yes, we've got an issue of patriarchy. But there's also some deep cultural stuff going on. So this is looking at views on domestic violence. This is the percentage of women who think that under certain circumstances a husband is justified in hitting his wife. And so you see it by country here. You've got the different countries, you've got the percentages here, and then you've got the wealth quintiles that they're from. So the light blue is the richest wealth quintile, and then the dark red is the poorest, and then the average is right there. Or yeah, so you see a big difference. In Jordan, 95% of the poorest of the poorest women, think that it's okay for a husband to hit their wives. 80% of wealthy women think that way. And, you see big gaps between the wealthiest and the poorest in some places, but basically everywhere you see pretty big gaps. A lot of this is cultural, different beliefs on gender roles and relations. Ukraine, you're starting to look more like Western Europe or the United States, where you've probably got, roughly around, less than 5% or something there. So again, this is patriarchy at work, but it's also something that's deeply embedded, not just in the minds of men that this is the way it should be, but in the minds of many women of different wealth groups. So why might wealth cause such a difference in these views? Education. Wealthier women are more likely to be educated. Women that are more likely to be educated are more likely to stand up for women's rights. Okay, so on Friday I'll end with a lecture talking about men. Just a few slides to go through there. And I'll make any adjustments and let you know of any updates to the course as we move along. I will be available during the normal course period today on Canvas chat in case you have any questions about today's lecture or anything else like that. I'll try to get out emails regarding ebook access and everything. All right, everybody, hang in there and we'll muddle through.